Welcome to North Stories. The hero of our story steps into the dimly lit room, glancing at the reflection in the cracked mirror. He barely recognizes the man staring back at him. Tired eyes, stubble that's long past being fashionable, and a weary slouch that's come to feel like second nature. My name isn't important, not really. But for now, let's call me Nick. Nick Lewis. I wasn't always like this. I had dreams, big ones. Back in college, I was that guy with the perfect plan, the one who had everything mapped out. I was going to design skyscrapers, make my mark on the city. But New York doesn't care about your plans, your dreams. It chews you up, spits you out, and leaves you in a dingy apartment with bills piling up and no way to pay them. I guess that's how it all started. Desperation has a funny way of clouding your judgment. You think you're making choices, but really, you're being swept up by circumstance. It wasn't just me either. It was all of us, each one of us a piece of the puzzle that fit together in ways we never expected. It was a Tuesday, one of those cold New York mornings where the chill bites at you, and the steam rises from the manholes like the city's exhaling its frustrations. I remember it because it was the day I met them, the people who would change everything. There was Ben first. We met at this coffee shop in the Lower East Side, the kind of place where the barista spends more time perfecting latte art than actually making coffee. Ben was slouched over his laptop, typing away furiously, his fingers dancing across the keys with a kind of nervous energy. We struck up a conversation over the slow Wi-Fi, which was about the only thing slower than my job prospects at the time. Ben was different. Tech genius, sure, but socially? Well, let's just say small talk wasn't his thing. He had this way of cutting through the noise and getting right to the heart of things. And when I told him about my situation, losing my job, the mounting debt, he didn't offer sympathy. He offered solutions. Or at least, what he thought was a solution. But we'll get to that. Then came Sarah. We met at a local community board meeting, of all places. I was there because I was trying to network, hoping maybe someone in the building industry would throw me a lifeline. Sarah was there for something much simpler: rage. She was furious. I didn't know the details then, but she'd been cheated out of her life savings, and she was there to make sure the guy responsible paid for it. Her fire caught my attention. She wasn't one to just sit back and accept her fate. Last, there was Rachel. She didn't come into the picture until later, but when she did, it was like everything clicked. Rachel was a single mom, working 2 jobs and doing whatever it took to keep her kid fed and a roof over their heads. Her tough exterior hid a heart of gold, and behind the wheel, she was a force of nature. There wasn't a car in the city she couldn't handle. Now I know what you're thinking. How did a washed-up architect, a tech-savvy recluse, an accountant with a grudge, and a single mom end up planning a bank heist? I'll get to that. But first, let me take you back to that fateful day. It started innocently enough. Ben and I were sitting in his cramped apartment, where cables and hard drives were strewn across the floor like some kind of digital battlefield. He was tinkering with a security system, one of those high-tech setups that the city's banks had started using. I didn't think much of it at the time. Ben was always messing around with tech, hacking into things just for the fun of it. But then he said something that stopped me cold. "You know," he muttered, almost to himself, "these systems aren't as airtight as they think. It wouldn't take much to get in if you knew what you were doing." I laughed it off at first. "What, you planning on robbing a bank now?" But Ben didn't laugh. He just looked at me, eyes serious behind those thick glasses of his. "Why not?" I remember the silence that followed. The kind that stretches on, fills the room with possibility and danger. It was a crazy idea, insane even. But it stuck with me. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how trapped I was. Trapped by my own failures, by a city that didn't care if I lived or died. I didn't say anything to Ben then, but the seed was planted. A few weeks later, I ran into Sarah again. She was still angry, still talking about how she was going to make the guy who scammed her pay. But this time, I saw something in her, a kind of desperation that mirrored my own. We were both drowning, and it felt like there was no way out. "Have you ever thought about just taking what's yours?" I asked her one night as we sat in a quiet corner of a bar. I could see the wheels turning in her mind. She didn't answer me right away, but I knew she was thinking about it. Things started to snowball after that. Sarah brought Rachel into the mix. Rachel wasn't one for long discussions. She was practical, efficient, and always thinking 10 steps ahead. We needed a driver, someone who could get us out of the city fast, and she was perfect. She didn't ask too many questions, just wanted to know what the plan was and how it could help her provide for her kid. It wasn't long before the four of us were sitting around Ben's apartment, the same place where the idea had first been born. We spent hours mapping out every detail, poring over floor plans, security footage, anything we could get our hands on. Ben's hacking skills came in handy. He got into the bank's system, figured out their weak points. Sarah used her knowledge of finances to help us understand the flow of money and when the vault would be most vulnerable. But it wasn't just about the technical stuff. There was a psychological aspect to it too. We had to get inside the heads of the people running the bank, the guards, the staff. We had to anticipate their moves, think like they would. It was like playing chess, except the stakes were much higher. There were moments when I thought we were in over our heads. There were times when it felt like the whole thing would fall apart before we even got started. But something kept pushing us forward. Maybe it was the desperation, the feeling that we had nothing left to lose. Or maybe it was the sense of camaraderie that had formed between us. We were no longer just four individuals struggling to survive in this city. We were a team. By the time the day of the heist arrived, we were ready. Or at least, as ready as we were ever going to be. There was a tension in the air that morning, a kind of electric buzz that made everything feel surreal. We went over the plan one last time, checked our equipment, and prepared ourselves for what was to come. As I stood outside the bank that afternoon, waiting for the signal, I couldn't help but think about how far I'd come. From the hopeful architect with big dreams to the man about to rob a bank. It wasn't how I'd imagined my life turning out, but here I was. And there was no turning back now. That's where it all began. And trust me, things were only going to get more complicated from here. I stood there, heart thudding in my chest as I watched the people go about their day. Ordinary people, mothers with strollers, businessmen on their phones, tourists staring up at the skyline. None of them had any idea what was about to happen, no clue that their lives were about to cross paths, however briefly, with something dangerous. Rachel was parked 2 blocks down, idling in a beat-up sedan that looked more suited for school runs than getaways. That was the point, nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention. We'd all agreed on that early on: blend in. Be invisible. The more ordinary we looked, the better. I glanced at my watch. Ben had hacked the security feed hours earlier, and he was holed up in some dingy cafe nearby, glued to his laptop. I could almost picture him there, fingers flying across the keyboard, a half-drunk coffee at his side. His job was critical, but quiet. He wasn't the type for the upfront, high-stakes action. He was the guy behind the curtain, pulling the strings, making sure no one saw what was really going on. Sarah stood next to me, dressed in a gray business suit, the kind that screamed respectability. She had a folder tucked under her arm, filled with fake documents, phony credentials. Her face was calm, almost bored, like she'd done this 100 times before. But I could see the tension in her jaw, the way her eyes flickered back and forth, scanning the street for any sign of trouble. She was our inside woman, the one who'd get us past the guards and into the heart of the bank. We'd timed everything down to the second. The bank's security system had a brief window of vulnerability, a gap Ben had discovered while digging through mountains of code. It wasn't much, a few minutes at best, but it was all we needed. The plan was tight, precise, and absolutely dependent on everyone doing their part perfectly. No mistakes, no second chances. I adjusted my collar and tried to steady my breathing. This was it. No more rehearsals, no more planning sessions in Ben's cramped apartment. This was real. And if we pulled it off, it could change everything. Sarah gave me a slight nod, and I knew that was the signal. Showtime. We walked into the bank like we belonged there. I've always thought that confidence was half the battle when it comes to pulling off something risky. Act like you're supposed to be there, and most people won't question it. The guard at the front barely glanced at us as we passed. He was slouched in his chair, his attention more on the flickering TV in the corner than the people walking through the doors. The bank itself was quiet, just a few customers milling around, waiting for their turn at the teller windows. The marble floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the air smelled faintly of disinfectant. It was the kind of place that tried to project an image of security and stability, but under the surface, you could feel the tension. These places didn't operate on trust. They operated on fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of someone like us slipping through the cracks. I felt the weight of the duffel bag slung over my shoulder, the tools inside clinking softly with every step. Sarah approached the counter with a confident stride, her face calm and unreadable. The teller, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, barely looked up as Sarah slid the folder across the counter. "I'm here for the audit," Sarah said, her voice cool and professional. The woman blinked, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Audit? I wasn't told. It was a last-minute request," Sarah cut in smoothly. "Corporate decided it was necessary. I'll need access to the vault and the security room. Shouldn't take more than an hour." The teller hesitated, glancing around nervously. Clearly, she wasn't used to things like this. But Sarah didn't flinch. She just stood there, her expression calm, her hand resting lightly on the folder. She looked so official, so composed, that it was almost impossible to doubt her. "Of course," the woman finally said, picking up the phone to call a supervisor. "Let me just..." That's when things started to go wrong. The phone didn't ring. The teller frowned, pressing the button again, but still, nothing. I felt a chill run down my spine. That wasn't part of the plan. Ben was supposed to disable the cameras and alarms, but not the phones. Something was off. Sarah shot me a quick glance, her eyes narrowing slightly. I could tell she was thinking the same thing. But there was no turning back now. We were too deep in. The supervisor arrived, a balding man in his 50s with a bad tie and a worse attitude. He looked annoyed, probably irritated that his quiet afternoon was being disrupted. But Sarah played her part perfectly, giving him the same calm, confident smile. "I'm afraid we've been having some trouble with the phones," she said smoothly. "Probably just a temporary glitch. It won't affect the audit." The supervisor eyed her for a moment, then shrugged. "All right. But make it quick. We're understaffed today." He waved us through the security door, the heavy metal clanging shut behind us with a finality that made my stomach churn. We were in. The hallway beyond the door was narrow and sterile, lit by harsh overhead lights that buzzed faintly. I could hear the faint hum of machinery somewhere in the distance, the vault buried deep within the bank's infrastructure. Sarah and I exchanged a glance, and I could see the tension in her eyes now, the calm facade slipping just a bit. We reached the security room first. It was a small, cramped space filled with monitors and blinking lights, the kind of place that screamed outdated technology. The guard inside was half asleep, his feet propped up on the desk, a cup of coffee growing cold next to him. He barely looked up when we walked in. Sarah stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply on the tile floor. "I'll need you to step outside for a moment," she said, her voice sharp and authoritative. "This is a private audit." The guard blinked, clearly confused. "But I..." "Now, please," she added, her tone leaving no room for argument. The guard hesitated for a moment, then shrugged and grabbed his coffee. As soon as he was out the door, Sarah moved quickly, locking it behind him. She turned to me, her eyes sharp. "All right," she said. "This is where you come in." I pulled the duffel bag from my shoulder and unzipped it, my fingers brushing against the cold metal of the tools inside. My heart was pounding in my ears now, the reality of what we were doing hitting me full force. This wasn't just planning anymore. This was it. I found the small device Ben had given me, a sleek black box with wires trailing from it. He'd explained how it worked a dozen times, but in the moment, My hands felt clumsy as I connected the wires to the bank's security system. The box beeped softly as it powered up, and I held my breath, waiting for the signal. The monitors flickered for a moment, then went dark. The cameras were down. Sarah exhaled softly, her eyes gleaming. "We're in." We moved quickly after that, navigating the narrow corridors toward the vault. Every second felt like an eternity, every sound magnified in the silence. I could hear the faint murmur of voices from the lobby, the soft clink of metal as I adjusted the tools in my bag. When we reached the vault door, my stomach tightened. It was massive, reinforced steel with a combination lock that looked impossible to crack. But we had a way in, thanks to Ben. His software bypassed the system, unlocking the digital combination. But there was one thing none of us could predict: the final obstacle we hadn't prepared for, hidden in plain sight. Something Ben's hacks couldn't touch. As the vault door swung open, my heart stopped. Inside, standing between us and the millions we'd planned to take, was someone I never expected to see. Someone who was supposed to be dead. The sight of him froze me where I stood, my mind struggling to reconcile what I was seeing with the reality I thought I knew. His face, those deep-set eyes, that crooked scar running across his cheek, was unmistakable. But that was impossible. He was supposed to be dead. I had seen the news, heard the rumors. No one had seen him in years. Yet here he was, standing in front of the vault, alive and very much in the way. I glanced at Sarah, but her expression mirrored my own shock. This wasn't part of the plan. Hell, this wasn't part of any plan. We were supposed to be in and out, no complications. But standing here, in front of us, was the kind of complication that could get us killed. His name was Marcus, Mad Dog, Russo, a notorious figure from New York's underworld, a legend among the city's criminal elite. He'd been involved in some of the biggest jobs the city had ever seen, until he vanished. The official story was that he'd gone underground, maybe fled the country. Some people said he'd been killed, taken out by one of his rivals. Others thought he'd retired, living quietly off his millions somewhere far away from New York's chaos. But no one ever thought he'd show up here, guarding a vault in a small community bank. That was the part that didn't make any sense. Russo wasn't some low-level thug. He didn't babysit money. He was a mastermind, a guy who orchestrated complex operations from the shadows. So why the hell was he here? "Nick?" His voice was low, gravelly, and somehow, he didn't seem as surprised to see me as I was to see him. "Long time, no see." I felt Sarah stiffen beside me, her hand inching toward her jacket, where we both knew she kept a small, hidden gun. We'd brought it for emergencies, but this wasn't the kind of emergency I had in mind. "Russo," I managed, my voice sounding much calmer than I felt. "Didn't expect to see you here." He gave a slow, knowing smile, the kind that always made my skin crawl. "Funny thing about life, Nick. It tends to throw people back together in the strangest places." His gaze flickered over to Sarah. "Who's the friend?" "None of your business," Sarah snapped, her voice sharp. "We're here for one reason. And it's not you." Russo chuckled, a low, menacing sound that echoed in the cold steel of the vault. "Oh, I think it is. See, I'm here because of you, Nick. You and your little crew. I've been watching, waiting for you to make a move. And now here we are." My mind raced, trying to figure out how we'd gotten here, how Russo had known. We'd been careful, at least I thought we had. Ben had handled all the digital breadcrumbs, erasing any trace of our planning, scrubbing our presence from the bank's systems. So how the hell had Russo known about this? And more importantly, why? "You're wondering how I found out," Russo said, as if reading my thoughts. He moved forward, just a step, but it was enough to make Sarah tense even more. "I've got eyes everywhere. Ears too. You of all people should know that, Nick. This is my city. You can't pull a heist like this without me knowing about it." My pulse quickened. I wasn't sure where this was going, but I didn't like it. Russo wasn't the type to show up just to make small talk. He had a plan, and whatever it wasn't good news for us. What do you want? I asked, cutting straight to the point. Russo smiled again, that same unsettling smile that made me feel like a pawn in a game I didn't even know I was playing. Simple. I want a cut. 50%. I blinked, my mouth going dry. 50%? That was insane. We'd spent weeks planning this, calculating every detail, every dollar. We needed that money. All of it. Between the four of us, it would barely be enough to cover what we each owed, to dig ourselves out of the holes we were in. Giving up half would destroy everything. You've lost your mind. Sarah spat, stepping forward. We're not giving you a damn thing. Russo didn't react, his smile fading into something colder, more dangerous. You sure about that? His voice dropped an octave, and there was a threat hanging in the air now, something unspoken but heavy. Because if you don't give me what I want, things are going to get messy. I could feel the tension rising, thickening in the air between us. Sarah's hand hovered dangerously close to her jacket now, and I knew that if this went any further, it could spiral out of control. Russo wasn't a man to be reasoned with, but he wasn't stupid either. If we pushed back, this could end in blood. But then, out of nowhere, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind us. Fast, panicked footsteps. I turned just as Ben burst into the room, his eyes wild and his face pale. We've got a problem, he panted, barely getting the words out between gasps. A big one. Russo's eyes flicked toward Ben, and for the first time, I saw a flash of something other than cold confidence in his face. He didn't know about Ben. That was our only advantage right now. What is it? I asked quickly, stepping toward Ben. Ben swallowed hard, glancing nervously between me, Sarah, and Russo. The cameras, they're not completely offline. Someone's patched into the feed. There's another system we didn't account for. And worse, someone's already called the cops. My heart dropped. This was turning into a disaster. Everything we'd worked for, all the careful planning, was unraveling before my eyes. And now we had not only Russo to deal with but the police, who were probably already on their way. I turned back to Russo, my mind racing. If we didn't move now, we'd lose everything. But how the hell were we going to get out of this? Russo wasn't going to let us just walk away, and the cops would be swarming the place any minute. All right, I said, my voice low and steady. You want 50%? Fine. But you're going to help us get out of here. You know the city better than anyone. You've got contacts, ways to make problems disappear. If we go down, you go down with us. So you either help us escape, or you get nothing. Russo's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening. I could see him calculating, weighing his options. He was a survivor, always thinking 5 steps ahead. He didn't need us to get the money. But he also didn't need the heat from the cops breathing down his neck. After a long, tense moment, he nodded slowly. All right, Nick. You've got yourself a deal. But remember, cross me, and you'll regret it. With that, he turned and walked past us, leaving the vault door wide open behind him. I exhaled sharply, glancing at Sarah, who still looked furious, but she nodded in agreement. We didn't have a choice. Not anymore. We need to move, Ben urged, his voice shaking. Now. The three of us quickly gathered what we could from the vault, far less than we planned on, but enough to make this worth the risk. Sarah moved with precision, counting the stacks, her eyes scanning for any mistakes. My mind was elsewhere, thinking about how we were going to escape, how we'd lost control of the situation the moment Russo had stepped into the picture. But we weren't out of it yet. As we made our way back through the labyrinth of hallways, I could hear the distant sound of sirens, faint but growing louder with every second. Rachel would be waiting outside, the car ready to go, but getting there with both the money and our lives intact was no longer a guarantee. Russo led the way, his steps unhurried despite the chaos unfolding around us. He seemed to revel in it, in the danger, in the power he held over us. I knew deep down that we hadn't really won. We were just playing into his hands, following his lead because we had no other choice. As we reached the back exit, Russo stopped abruptly, turning to face me. His smile was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "Remember, Nick," he said softly. "I'm doing you a favor. Don't forget who's really in charge here." Before I could respond, the door swung open, and there was Rachel, sitting behind the wheel, her eyes wide with urgency. "Get in!" she shouted, her voice barely audible over the blaring sirens. We piled into the car, the heavy bags of cash thudding onto the floor as Rachel hit the gas, the tires screeching as we tore down the narrow alleyway. The sirens were deafening now, but as we sped through the streets of New York, weaving in and out of traffic, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of calm settle over me. We'd made it this far. We weren't out of the woods yet, but we were moving. Alive. Still in the game. I glanced at Russo, sitting in the back seat, his eyes locked on mine through the rearview mirror. There was something in his gaze, something that told me this was far from over. The man was like a snake, cold, calculating, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Whatever deal we made with him, it didn't sit right. But right now, we had bigger problems. The sound of sirens grew louder behind us, their shrill wails cutting through the chaotic New York night like a knife. Rachel's hands were tight on the steering wheel, her knuckles white, eyes focused and fierce. We sped through the streets, weaving in and out of traffic with a skill I'd never fully appreciated until now. Horns blared, cars swerved, and pedestrians leapt back onto sidewalks as we tore through intersections. But no matter how fast we moved, the police were closing in. I twisted in my seat, looking out the rear window. Red and blue lights flashed in the distance, the police cruisers gaining on us. "Rachel, we've got to lose them," I muttered, trying to keep my voice calm. But the tension was suffocating. "I know," she snapped back, her voice sharp with adrenaline. "Just give me a second." She gritted her teeth, eyes darting between the road ahead and the side streets, calculating a route only she could see. She was good. Better than I'd given her credit for. But this wasn't just about skill anymore. We needed luck. "Ben, what's the plan?" I turned to the back seat where Ben was hunched over his laptop, frantically tapping away at the keys. His face was pale, beads of sweat trickling down his forehead. There's a tunnel 2 blocks ahead," he stammered, his voice shaky. "If we can make it there, I can cut the lights. It'll give us enough time to disappear." Russo, sitting beside Ben with that infuriating calm, leaned back and lit a cigarette, completely unfazed by the chaos around him. "I hope for your sake that your little hacker friend is right, Nick." He exhaled a cloud of smoke, eyes never leaving mine. "Because if we get caught, I'm not the one they're coming for first." I ignored him, focusing on Ben. "You better make this work, Ben. No mistakes." He nodded, fingers moving faster across the keyboard. The tunnel was close, but so were the cops. I could see the lights reflecting off the glass of nearby buildings, the low growl of engines growing louder. We didn't have much time. "Rachel, get us to that tunnel!" I shouted, my pulse racing. Rachel swerved hard to the right, nearly clipping a parked car as we shot down a narrow side street. I could feel the tires struggling to grip the wet pavement, the car fishtailing for a moment before she regained control. Another hard left, and there it was, the tunnel, a gaping black maw that stretched under the city like an artery. It was our only chance. We barreled toward it, but the police weren't far behind. Just as we hit the entrance, Ben slammed his hand down on the keyboard. The lights flickered and then plunged into darkness. Rachel floored it, and we were swallowed by the tunnel's shadowy depths. Inside, it was pitch black. The only sound was the roaring of the engine and the distant, fading wail of the sirens. My heart was hammering in my chest as I waited, holding my breath. This was the moment. If Ben's hack had worked, we might just make it out. If not, seconds ticked by like hours. Then, slowly, the sound of the police began to fade. The tunnel curved ahead, and Rachel took the turn expertly, guiding us into a side passage that led to an abandoned section. I released a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "Ben, did you?" "I did it," he breathed, almost in disbelief. "I actually did it." Sarah, who had been silent until now, leaned back in her seat, letting out a shaky laugh. I can't believe that worked. But as the tension began to ease, I felt that familiar prickle of unease. It wasn't over, not yet. We were out of immediate danger, but we were far from safe. We still had Russo in the back seat, and we still had the money. That meant trouble. Rachel brought the car to a slow stop in the abandoned part of the tunnel, where it was pitch black. She killed the engine, and we sat in silence for a moment, the echoes of the outside world distant and muffled. I turned in my seat to face Russo. "All right," I said, keeping my voice steady. "You got us out of there. Now let's settle this. You wanted 50%, fine. But once you get your cut, we're done. You walk away, we walk away, and we never see each other again." Russo smirked, that cold, reptilian smile returning to his face. "You think it's that simple, Nick? After all this?" He leaned forward, his eyes glinting in the dark. "I don't think you understand who's really in control here. This isn't just about money anymore." "What the hell are you talking about?" Sarah cut in, her voice laced with suspicion. Russo flicked his cigarette out the window, his smile never wavering. "You think this was your plan? That you came up with this brilliant little heist all on your own?" "Oh no, sweetheart. This was my plan from the start. I've been pulling the strings all along. You just didn't know it." I stared at him, my mind reeling. "What are you talking about? We planned this." You planned nothing," Russo interrupted, his voice cool and menacing. "I fed you the idea. I let you think it was yours. But I've been one step ahead the whole time." My heart sank. It all made sense now. How he'd known about the job, how he'd found us at the vault. He hadn't just stumbled upon us by accident. He'd been watching, manipulating. The whole thing had been a setup. I clenched my fists, anger boiling beneath the surface. Why? Why go through all this? If you wanted the money, you could have just taken it. Russo laughed softly. Because, Nick, money is just a means to an end. What I want is control. Power. And now that I've got you all in my pocket, I have both. Ben's face went pale, his hands shaking as he closed the laptop. We're not working for you, he stammered. This wasn't part of the deal. Russo shrugged. You don't have a choice. You see, the police aren't the only ones looking for you. By now, I've made sure every major crime family in this city knows your faces, knows what you're worth. If you try to walk away, they'll come for you. And believe me, they'll be much less forgiving than I am. Sarah's hand moved toward her jacket again, but Russo held up a hand. I wouldn't do that if I were you. This car is wired. One wrong move, and we all go up in flames. The silence in the car was deafening. The weight of his words hung over us like a storm cloud. We were trapped, caught in his web, and there was no easy way out. So what now? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Russo's smile widened. Now you work for me. I've got bigger plans, and you're going to help me execute them. You're smart, Nick. You've got potential. That's why I chose you. But don't get any ideas about betraying me. I know everything about you, all your weaknesses, all your secrets. One misstep, and it's over. For all of you. I glanced at Sarah, who was staring straight ahead, her jaw clenched. Ben looked like he was about to be sick. And Rachel, gripping the steering wheel, was doing her best to hold it together, but I could see the fear in her eyes. We were in too deep. There was no walking away from this. Not without paying the price. Russo leaned back in his seat, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Welcome to the big leagues, Nick. And as the reality of our situation sank in, I realized that this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. As we sat in that darkened tunnel, the weight of Russo's words crashed down on me like a tidal wave. Every breath felt heavy, thick with the realization that we had just crossed a line we couldn't uncross. He hadn't just hijacked our heist, he'd hijacked our lives. And I had led us right into his trap. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sounds were the distant hum of traffic outside the tunnel and the low, rhythmic tapping of Rachel's fingers against the steering wheel. I could feel her anger, her frustration, and beneath it all, the fear we all shared. Fear of what came next. Russo shifted in his seat, the faint glow of his cigarette casting his face in sharp relief. "Look, Nick," he said, his tone casual, like we were discussing a business deal rather than the wreckage of our future. "I'm not your enemy here. In fact, I'm offering you something most people would kill for. A chance to step up. To be more than a petty thief pulling small-time jobs. You've got the brains. You've got the crew. All you need is someone to show you how the real game works." "Game?" Sarah's voice cut through the silence, sharp and cold. "Is that what this is to you? A game? You're playing with our lives like we're pieces on a board." Russo shrugged. "Call it whatever you want. But the truth is, you're in this now, and there's no going back. You think you can just take the money and disappear? I've already told you, that's not an option. Not unless you want to spend the rest of your lives looking over your shoulders." I could see Sarah bristling beside me, her hand still hovering near her jacket. Her defiance was admirable, but this was a fight we couldn't win, not yet. Not without knowing more about the man we were up against. "We need to be smart about this," I said, more to Sarah than to Russo. "We play along for now." Her eyes flashed with anger, but after a moment she nodded slightly, understanding the grim reality of our situation. We were stuck. Russo had made sure of that. "So, what's the job?" I asked Russo, my voice steady but laced with resentment. "If we're working for you, I want to know what we're getting into." Russo smiled, clearly pleased that I was starting to play along. "That's more like it. Now, I can't give you all the details just yet, but let's just say it's a bit more ambitious than robbing a local bank. This is a multi-city operation, and I'm going to need your expertise. All of you." Ben, who had been silent and tense the entire time, finally spoke up, his voice trembling. "What do you mean, multi-city? We're not some professional crew. We can't pull off something like that." Russo leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he focused on Ben. "That's where you're wrong, kid. You've got skills most people in this business would kill for. You can get in and out of systems like it's child's play. And trust me, in my line of work, that's a damn valuable asset." Ben swallowed hard, his hands shaking as he ran them through his hair. I knew what he was thinking, that this was way beyond anything he'd ever signed up for. But we were all in the same boat now, whether we liked it or not. Rachel finally broke her silence, her voice steady but barely masking her fury. "You're saying we're part of a bigger plan, but what happens if we don't want in? What happens if we walk away right now?" Russo's smile faded, and his expression turned dark. "You don't walk away, Rachel. Not from this. The second you stepped into that bank, you sealed your fate. Now, I've been generous so far, but don't push me. You're going to do the job. And when it's done, you'll get your cut. A real one this time." I clenched my fists, knowing there was no arguing with him. We were being dragged deeper into his world, and no amount of bargaining was going to get us out of it. Not without a plan. Not without an escape route. But that was a problem for another day. Right now, survival was the only thing that mattered. Russo took one last drag of his cigarette, then flicked it out the window before giving us a long, hard look. "You'll be hearing from me soon. In the meantime, keep your heads down. Don't do anything stupid. Because believe me, if you tried to cross me, it'll be the last mistake you ever make." With that, he stepped out of the car, his figure disappearing into the shadows of the tunnel. The moment he was gone, the tension inside the car exploded. Sarah slammed her fist against the dashboard. "God damn it! How the hell did we end up in this mess?" Rachel was breathing hard, her hands shaking on the wheel. "We need to get out of here. Now." I turned to Ben, who was staring blankly at his laptop, the glow from the screen casting eerie shadows across his face. "Ben, can you track him? Can you find out where he's going?" Ben blinked, his eyes snapping back to reality. I don't know. Maybe. I mean, he's got to be using some kind of encrypted comms, but I can try. I can try to trace him. Do it, I said, my voice firm. We need to know what we're dealing with. As Ben started typing furiously, Sarah leaned closer to me, her voice low and furious. Nick, we can't do this. We can't keep working for that psychopath. He'll use us until we're no longer useful, and then he'll dump us, or worse. I know, I whispered back, my mind already racing with ideas. But we can't just run. He's got us pinned down, and we don't know how deep his connections go. We have to play this smart. We have to be patient. Sarah's eyes were filled with frustration, but she didn't argue. She knew as well as I did that we were out of options. For now, at least. Rachel started the car again, pulling us out of the tunnel and back onto the streets. The city was quieter now, the chaos of the chase left behind us, but the weight of our situation hung heavy in the air. None of us spoke as we drove, the silence thick with fear and uncertainty. We eventually pulled up in front of an old warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It was one of Ben's safe houses, a place he'd used before when he needed to lay low. As we stepped out of the car, the cool night air hit me, but it did nothing to clear the fog in my head. Inside the warehouse, we gathered around a makeshift table, the tension still palpable. Ben was hunched over his laptop, typing away in silence while Sarah paced the room, her frustration mounting with every step. Rachel stood by the window, peering out into the night, her face a mask of quiet determination. We need a plan, I said finally, breaking the silence. And what exactly is that plan, Nick? Sarah snapped, her voice laced with anger. We're stuck in this. Russo has us by the throat, and if we don't do what he says, we're dead. I know that, I shot back, trying to keep my own frustration in check. But we're not going to be his puppets forever. We'll play along for now. But we need to figure out a way to turn the tables on him. We need to gather information, find out who he's working with, what his endgame is. And when the time is right, we hit him where it hurts. Ben looked up from his laptop, his eyes wide with worry. Nick, I don't think you understand. Russo, he's connected. I mean, really connected. He's got people everywhere, cops, politicians, the mob. If we make a move against him, he'll know. And he'll kill us before we even get close. Then we'll have to be smarter than him. I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. We've made it this far. We'll figure out a way. Sarah sighed, running a hand through her hair. I hope you're right. Because if you're not, we're all dead. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. We all knew the stakes. As the hours stretched on, the exhaustion of the night began to take its toll. One by one, we found places to rest, Ben curled up in a corner with his laptop, Sarah lying on an old, battered couch, and Rachel sitting by the window, keeping watch. I stayed awake, my mind churning with thoughts of what came next. I knew Russo wasn't done with us. He was playing a long game, and we were just pawns on his board. But there had to be a way to beat him. There had to be. As the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the warehouse walls, I made a silent promise to myself. I wasn't going to let Russo control our lives forever. I was going to find a way out of this, no matter what it took. But deep down, I knew it wasn't going to be easy. The road ahead was dark and dangerous, and every step we took brought us closer to the edge. And one wrong move could send us plummeting into a freefall we might never recover from. The light from the rising sun spilled through the cracked windows of the warehouse, casting a dull orange glow on the worn-out furniture and dusty floors. Despite the tension that had kept us awake through the night, exhaustion finally started to seep in, settling over us like a heavy blanket. My thoughts, however, were anything but restful. Russo had plans for us, and while we had temporarily slipped out from under the immediate threat, it was only a matter of time before we were thrown back into the fire. I sat on a rusted metal chair, staring blankly at the empty space in front of me. The sounds of the city waking up outside only deepened the surreal feeling that had settled over me. How had it come to this? What started as a desperate attempt to dig ourselves out of financial ruin had spiraled into a nightmare that seemed to have no escape. The others stirred around me. Ben's fingers were still moving across his keyboard, his eyes bloodshot and glazed over from lack of sleep. Rachel sat slumped by the window, her head resting against the glass, lost in her thoughts. Sarah, ever restless, had abandoned the couch to pace the length of the room, her frustration simmering just beneath the surface. "Nick!" Her voice broke the silence, sharp and biting. "We can't keep going like this. We need a real plan. You said we'd find a way out of this, but what's your actual strategy? Because if we don't do something soon, Russo's going to use us until we're all dead or worse, locked up for life." I couldn't blame her. She had every right to be angry. I was supposed to have the answers, to be the one leading us, and yet here we were, stuck in limbo. I rubbed a hand across my face, trying to gather my thoughts, but the weight of it all pressed down on me harder with every passing second. "We need leverage," I said finally, though the words felt weak even as they left my mouth. "Russo has us because he thinks we're useful, but if we can find something, anything, that he values more than us, maybe we can turn the tables." Ben looked up from his laptop, skeptical. "You mean like blackmail?" "Nick, we don't even know where to start. Russo's got connections everywhere. It's not like we can just pull something out of thin air and hope it sticks." Sarah crossed her arms, her expression hard. "So what, we just keep doing his dirty work until we get lucky?" "No." I shook my head. "But we're not going to be able to fight him head on. We need to bide our time, gather information. We figure out what Russo's endgame is, and we use that against him." "Great plan," Rachel muttered from her spot by the window, her voice thick with sarcasm. "Just one problem. We don't have time. You think Russo's going to let us hang out in this safe house while we play detective? He'll have us on another job before we even have a chance to breathe." I knew she was right. Russo had made it clear that we weren't just working for him now, we were part of his larger operation, whether we liked it or not. And as much as I wanted to believe we could outmaneuver him, the truth was, we were flying blind. "Nick!" Ben's voice interrupted my thoughts. He was still hunched over his laptop, but his tone had changed, tinged with something like excitement. "I think I've got something." We all turned to him, the sudden shift in energy palpable. "What do you mean?" I asked, moving closer to see what he had pulled up on the screen. Ben glanced up at me, his eyes wide. "I've been running a trace, trying to dig up anything on Russo's communications, any encrypted networks he might be using, any signals that could give us a lead. And I found something. He's been communicating with someone in Toronto." There was a moment of silence as we processed Ben's words. Toronto? Russo had been careful, meticulous, never giving away too much about his operations or his contacts. But if Ben had managed to uncover something significant, this could be the break we needed. "Toronto?" Sarah repeated, moving to stand behind Ben's chair. "What's in Toronto? Who's he talking to?" Ben's fingers flew across the keyboard as he pulled up more data, lines of code and signals flashing on the screen. "I don't know exactly who yet, but it's big. The encryption is military grade, which means it's not just some random thug or low-level connection. Whoever this is, they've got serious pull, and they're hiding something." Rachel pushed off the windowsill and joined us, her eyes narrowing. "So what does that mean for us? Do we follow the trail? Find out who this guy is?" I crossed my arms, leaning over the table to get a closer look at the information Ben had pulled. "It means Russo isn't just a local player. He's connected to something bigger, something that reaches beyond New York. And if we can find out who he's dealing with in Toronto, we might be able to get the leverage we need. Assuming they don't kill us first." Rachel muttered, though the fire in her eyes told me she was already on board with the idea. She wasn't one to back down from a challenge, and neither were the rest of us. We were in too deep now, and if there was even a small chance of getting out, we had to take it. "Ben, can you trace any more of this?" I asked, my mind already racing with the possibilities. "Anything that will give us a name or a specific location?" "I'm working on it," he said, not looking up from the screen. "But this is going to take time. Whoever this contact is, they're good at covering their tracks. I've only just managed to scratch the surface. We don't have much time, Sarah said, pacing again. Russo's going to call us soon, and when he does, we'll be back on another job before we even get close to figuring this out. I know, I replied, my voice steady but laced with urgency. Which is why we have to move fast. We'll give Ben a couple more hours to dig up what he can. After that, we decide our next step. As Ben worked, the rest of us fell into a tense silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The weight of the situation was growing heavier by the minute, and the clock was ticking. I could feel it, Russo's shadow looming over us, his unseen hand guiding us toward whatever twisted plan he had in mind. But now, for the first time, we had something. A thread. And if we pulled on it hard enough, maybe, just maybe, it would unravel everything. After what felt like hours, Ben finally leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. I've got something, he said, and we all crowded around the screen again. What is it? I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. Ben tapped a few keys, and a map of Toronto appeared on the screen, with a small, pulsing dot marking a specific location. I traced the signal to this address. It's a warehouse in an industrial part of the city, near the waterfront. Looks like it's been abandoned for years, but there's been a lot of encrypted activity coming from there over the past few months. That's it? Rachel asked, frowning. An abandoned warehouse? Not just any warehouse, Ben replied, his voice low. It's heavily secured, cameras, motion detectors, the works. Whoever's operating out of there doesn't want to be found. I exchanged a glance with Sarah and Rachel. This was the break we needed, but it also meant we were about to take a much bigger risk. If we went to Toronto, we'd be leaving behind everything familiar, everything that had kept us relatively safe up until now. But staying in New York wasn't an option anymore. Russo had too tight a grip on us here, and if we didn't act fast, we'd lose our only chance to turn the tables. We're going to have to go there, I said finally, my voice firm. It's our only shot at getting the information we need. If we can figure out who Russo's working with, we might be able to cut a deal or at least get some leverage to keep ourselves alive. How do we even get there without Russo knowing? Sarah asked. He's got eyes everywhere. If we just disappear, he'll know something's up. We go in shifts, I suggested, thinking quickly. Rachel and I will head out first. Ben and Sarah, you stay here, keep an eye on things, and continue digging up whatever you can. We'll use burner phones, encrypted comms. We keep our heads low and move fast. Rachel nodded, already slipping into her role as the driver. I'll get the car ready. If we leave within the hour, we can be in Toronto by morning. Sarah hesitated, her eyes flickering with doubt. Are you sure about this, Nick? We're playing a dangerous game here. If Russo finds out. He won't, I said, cutting her off. We'll make sure of it. And if this goes south, we'll find a way to disappear for good. But we're not going to let him control us forever. Ben looked up from his laptop, his face pale but determined. I'll keep working on the signal. If I find anything else while you're gone, I'll let you know. Good, I said, standing up and stretching my sore limbs. We've got one chance to do this right. Let's not waste it. An hour later, Rachel and I were in the car, speeding down the highway with the skyline of New York fading into the distance behind us. The weight of the decision we'd made settled in as we drove, the cold night air whipping through the cracked windows. Neither of us spoke much, both of us lost in our own thoughts about what lay ahead. The drive to Toronto was long and grueling, the hours stretching out before us like an endless road. But despite the exhaustion, the fear, and the uncertainty, I felt a strange sense of resolve settling over me. For the first time in what felt like forever, we were taking control, making a move instead of reacting to whatever Russo threw our way. As we crossed the border into Canada, the distant lights of Toronto finally came into view, shimmering against the dark horizon. I glanced at Rachel, who tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her eyes locked on the road ahead. This is it, she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. Yeah, I replied, my pulse quickening. This is it. We pulled off the highway and wound our way through the quiet streets of Toronto, heading toward the industrial district where Ben had traced the signal. The city was eerily quiet at this hour, the streets deserted, the tall buildings casting long shadows in the moonlight. Finally, we arrived at the address. The warehouse loomed before us, a massive, hulking structure surrounded by a chain-link fence and covered in graffiti. It looked abandoned, just as Ben had said, but there was something about it that felt off. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I scanned the perimeter, searching for signs of movement. "Do you see any cameras?" Rachel asked, her voice low as she leaned forward, peering through the windshield. "Yeah," I muttered, spotting a small black lens near the top of the fence, swiveling slowly back and forth. Ben wasn't kidding about the security. "How do we get in?" she asked, turning to me. I thought for a moment, weighing our options. We could try to sneak in, find a way to disable the cameras and slip through the fence. But if this place was as heavily guarded as it seemed, there was a good chance we'd trigger an alarm the second we set foot inside. "We'll have to go in quiet," I said finally. "Find a blind spot, somewhere the cameras can't see us. Once we're inside, we figure out what we're dealing with." Rachel nodded, her face set in determination. "Let's do it." We slipped out of the car and approached the fence, sticking to the shadows as we moved closer to the building. My heart pounded in my chest as we ducked under one of the cameras, making our way toward a small section of the fence that looked weaker than the rest. With a quick glance around to make sure we weren't being watched, I pulled a small set of wire cutters from my jacket and began snipping away at the links. It took a few tense moments, but finally, we had a hole big enough to squeeze through. Rachel went first, slipping inside with ease, and I followed close behind, the adrenaline coursing through my veins. Once inside, we crouched low, making our way toward the building. The closer we got, the more uneasy I felt. Something wasn't right about this place. It was too quiet, too still. And then, as we reached the side of the warehouse, I saw it, a faint light flickering inside one of the windows. "We're not alone," I whispered, my throat dry. Rachel's eyes widened, and she nodded, her hand hovering near her jacket, where I knew she kept her gun. "Stay close," I said, my voice barely audible as we crept toward the door. We had no idea what waited for us inside that warehouse, but we were about to find out. With a deep breath, I pressed my ear to the rusted metal door. Through the thick steel, I could faintly make out voices, muffled, but undeniably there. Someone was inside. Rachel and I exchanged a glance, and without a word, I reached for the door handle. It was unlocked. I eased the door open, careful not to make a sound. The dim light inside spilled out into the alley, casting long shadows as we slipped in. The interior of the warehouse was just as eerie as the outside, rows of rusted machinery, old crates stacked haphazardly, and a musty smell that clung to the air. But in the center of it all, lit by a single hanging bulb, was something much more modern, a sleek, high-tech setup of computers, servers, and monitors. And standing before it, with his back turned to us, was a man. Rachel and I froze, pressing ourselves against the wall. The man hadn't seen us, his focus entirely on the screens in front of him. From our vantage point, I couldn't make out what he was doing, but I could see his hand moving rapidly over the keyboard, entering what looked like strings of code. I nodded at Rachel, and we slowly began to edge closer, our footsteps silent on the concrete floor. My mind raced with possibilities. Was this the contact Russo had been communicating with? If we could get the jump on him, maybe we could force some answers out of him, find out what Russo's real plan was, and why Toronto was so important. As we crept closer, the man suddenly stopped typing. My heart skipped a beat as he reached up to his ear, tapping a small earpiece I hadn't noticed before. "Yeah, I'm here," he said quietly, his voice low and calm. "The signal's been traced. They'll be here soon." My blood ran cold. He knew. Somehow, he knew we were coming. Rachel's eyes met mine, and I could see the same realization dawning on her face. We had walked straight into a trap. Without warning, the man spun around, his eyes locking onto us with a cold, calculating stare. He didn't look surprised. If anything, he seemed almost amused. He was tall, with a sharp jawline and eyes that seemed to glint with a dangerous intelligence. In his hand, he held a small device, his thumb hovering over a button. "I was wondering when you'd show up," he said, his voice dripping with calm confidence. "Russo's little pawns, right?" I didn't respond, my mind racing as I sized him up. If he pressed that button, whatever it controlled could blow this whole thing wide open. We needed to act fast, but we couldn't risk tipping him off. "What is this?" Rachel demanded, stepping forward with her hands still near her gun. "Who the hell are you?" The man smirked, his thumb still poised over the button. "Let's just say I'm the guy who keeps things running smoothly. And right now you two are in the way." In the blink of an eye, Rachel drew her gun, leveling it at the man's chest. "Drop it. Now." For a moment, the man didn't move, his eyes flicking between Rachel and me. Then, slowly, he raised his other hand in a mock surrender, though the smirk never left his face. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said. "But you're playing a game you don't understand. Russo has bigger plans for you than you realize." I stepped forward, my voice low and steady. "Then tell us. What's he planning? Why Toronto? What's in that warehouse?" The man's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it, only a chilling, calculated coldness. "You really think you're going to make it out of here alive? You're not the first ones Russo's sent to do his dirty work. And you won't be the last." He glanced down at the device in his hand, and before I could react, his thumb pressed down. The lights in the warehouse flickered once, then the entire building was plunged into darkness. "Run!" I shouted to Rachel, my instincts kicking in as the sound of footsteps filled the room. Rachel didn't need to be told twice. We bolted through the darkness, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the warehouse as we ran blindly for the door we'd come through. Behind us, I heard the man's voice, calm and collected even in the chaos. "They won't get far." Before I could make sense of his words, I heard a metallic click, followed by a soft hum. My stomach dropped as the floor beneath us suddenly rumbled to life. Rachel and I skidded to a halt, only to see steel shutters descending rapidly over the exits, sealing us inside. "Shit!" Rachel cursed, turning back toward the dim outlines of the machinery. We were trapped. The darkness was disorienting, the few faint streaks of light from the outside world barely filtering through cracks in the walls. My eyes adjusted slowly, but I could still hear the man moving somewhere behind us, his footsteps unnervingly measured. He wasn't in any hurry. He knew we had nowhere to go. "Nick, what do we do?" Rachel whispered, her voice low and tense as she pressed herself against one of the old machines. "We're sitting ducks in here." I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "We find another way out. There's got to be something, an old vent, a side door we missed. We just have to keep moving." "Or," came the man's voice from the darkness, "you could save yourself the trouble and surrender. I'm sure Russo would appreciate knowing that you tried." My hand tightened around the small flashlight in my pocket. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I clicked it on, the weak beam of light slicing through the darkness. Rachel and I moved quickly, darting between the machinery and crates as we scanned the walls for any sign of an escape. "Do you hear that?" Rachel whispered after a moment, her eyes darting around. I paused, listening closely. At first, I couldn't make out anything but our own breathing and the faint hum of the machines. But then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic ticking. I frowned, shining the flashlight in the direction of the sound. "What is that?" We crept toward the source of the noise, the ticking growing louder as we approached. And then, as I swung the beam of light toward the floor, my heart stopped. A small, black box was attached to one of the support beams. Wires extended from it, snaking along the ground and up the walls, disappearing into the shadows. But it wasn't the wires that caught my attention. It was the bright red numbers on the face of the box, counting down. 30 seconds. "Bomb!" I yelled, grabbing Rachel's arm and pulling her back. "Go! Now!" We sprinted in the opposite direction, my mind racing. 30 seconds wasn't enough time to disable the thing, and we had no idea how big the blast radius was going to be. All we could do was run. I could hear the man laughing somewhere in the darkness, his voice carrying over the ticking bomb. "I told you, you won't get far!" I ignored him, my focus solely on finding a way out. Rachel was ahead of me, darting between the shadows as we raced toward the far side of the warehouse. There had to be something, a way to get past those shutters or find an exit they hadn't sealed. 20 seconds. We reached the far wall, and I frantically shined the light along its surface, searching for anything that could help us. And then, there it was, an old service hatch, partially hidden behind a stack of crates. "Rachel!" I called, already moving toward it. "Over here!" She rushed to my side, and together we shoved the crates aside, revealing the small door. It was rusted and bent, but it looked like it might still open. I grabbed the handle and yanked with all my strength, the door groaning in protest as it slowly gave way. 10 seconds. We scrambled through the hatch, the sound of the ticking bomb echoing in my ears as we crawled into a narrow service tunnel. It was pitch black, the walls pressing in on us as we moved as fast as we could, our bodies scraping against the metal. 5 seconds. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, panic threatening to take over. But there was no time for fear, no time for second guessing. We had to keep moving. 3 seconds. Rachel was ahead of me, her body disappearing into the darkness. I could hear her breathing, fast and shallow, as we pushed ourselves forward with everything we had. 1 second. And then, the world behind us exploded. The force of the blast sent a shockwave through the tunnel, knocking me flat on my stomach. My ears rang with the deafening roar of the explosion, the ground shaking beneath me as chunks of debris rained down around us. For a moment I couldn't move. The air was thick with dust and smoke, and my lungs burned as I struggled to breathe. I could barely hear anything over the ringing in my ears, but through the haze, I heard Rachel's voice. "Nick!" she called, her voice muffled but desperate. "Are you okay?" I coughed, trying to force myself upright. My whole body ached, but I was alive. Somehow we had survived. "Yeah," I rasped, pushing myself up onto my hands and knees. "I'm good." "You?" "I'm okay," she replied, her voice shaky with relief. "But we need to get out of here before the whole place comes down." I nodded, though she couldn't see me, and we continued crawling through the tunnel, our movements slow and labored. The explosion had left the air thick with dust, and every breath felt like a battle. But the adrenaline kept us moving, inching our way toward what we hoped was safety. After what felt like an eternity, we finally emerged from the tunnel into another part of the warehouse, this one much smaller, with no sign of the fire that was surely raging behind us. I collapsed against the wall, my chest heaving as I struggled to catch my breath. Rachel sank down beside me, wiping the sweat and grime from her face. "That was way too close," she muttered. I nodded, wiping my forehead with the back of my hand. "We're not out of this yet," I said, my voice grim. "The man, the one who set the bomb, he's still here somewhere. And he's not going to let us leave without a fight." Rachel's eyes darkened, and she nodded in agreement. "Then we take him down, before he can try anything else." I couldn't argue with that. We had no choice but to confront him, and soon. But first, we needed to gather our strength, figure out exactly where he was, and how to outsmart him. As we sat there, trying to recover, I couldn't help but think about what the man had said. He had mentioned that Russo had sent others before us, and that we weren't the first ones to be caught in this twisted game. But what did that mean? How many others had fallen into this trap? And why did Russo keep pulling people into this dangerous web? I didn't have the answers yet, but I was determined to find out. And when I did, I'd make sure Russo and his entire operation paid the price. But for now, survival was the only thing that mattered. After a few minutes, Rachel stood up, her expression steely. "We need to move. He's not going to wait for us to get our bearings." I nodded, forcing myself to stand. My body protested every movement, but I pushed through the pain. There was no time to rest. We moved cautiously through the smaller section of the warehouse, keeping to the shadows as we searched for any sign of the man. My mind was still reeling from the explosion, and every creak of the building sent a fresh wave of anxiety through me. Then, as we rounded a corner, we saw him. The man was standing at the far end of the room, calmly packing up the last of the equipment. He didn't seem concerned about the explosion or the fact that we had survived it. If anything, he looked bored. "Glad you made it," he said without looking up. "Would have been a shame if you hadn't." Rachel didn't hesitate. She raised her gun, aiming it directly at his chest. "Enough games. Tell us what Russo's planning, or I swear I'll put a bullet in your head." The man chuckled, his back still to us. "You think I'm afraid of dying? I've been in this business too long for that." He zipped up the bag in front of him and finally turned to face us, his expression calm and infuriatingly smug. "But if you want answers, you're going to have to earn them." In a flash, he reached into his coat, pulling out a gun of his own. Time slowed as I lunged for cover, shouting for Rachel to do the same. The room erupted in gunfire. Bullets flew through the air, whizzing past as Rachel and I dove behind a stack of old machinery. The deafening roar of gunfire echoed through the warehouse, and my heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of the chaos. The man moved with precision, every shot aimed with deadly intent. Rachel returned fire, her movements swift and calculated. She was a natural in moments like this, focused, unshaken by the danger around us. I, on the other hand, felt every nerve in my body screaming, but I forced myself to stay calm. This wasn't the first time we'd been in a life-or-death situation, and it wouldn't be the last. I peeked out from behind the machinery, catching a glimpse of the man as he ducked behind a support beam. He was fast, his every move deliberate. He knew this space better than we did, using the layout of the warehouse to his advantage. "Cover me!" Rachel shouted, pulling something from her pocket. I didn't have time to ask what it was. I leaned out and fired a few shots in the man's direction, keeping him pinned down while Rachel prepared whatever she was planning. The sharp ping of bullets hitting metal filled the air as I fired off round after round. Then, suddenly, Rachel leaped from cover, tossing a small black device across the room. It landed near the man's feet with a soft thud. A flashbang. I turned away just in time, covering my eyes as the bright, blinding flash lit up the room, followed by a deafening bang that left my ears ringing. The man shouted in surprise, stumbling backward as the flash disoriented him. This was our chance. Rachel didn't hesitate. She rushed forward, closing the distance between her and the man in a matter of seconds. Before he could recover, she tackled him to the ground, her gun pressed firmly to his temple. "Don't move," she hissed, her voice low and threatening. "You so much as twitch, and I'll paint this floor with your brains." The man grunted in pain, his face twisted in frustration, but he didn't try to fight her off. He knew he was beaten. I hurried over, keeping my gun trained on him just in case. My heart was still racing, adrenaline pumping through my veins. We had him. Finally, we had him. "Start talking," I said, my voice rough from the chaos. "What's Russo planning? Why send us to Toronto? What's in that warehouse?" The man let out a short, bitter laugh, his face still pressed against the cold concrete floor. "You really don't get it, do you? Maybe you didn't hear him," Rachel said, pressing the barrel of her gun harder against his skull. "Start talking." He winced but didn't lose his smirk. "You think Russo cares about you? About any of this? You're just pawns. Disposable. Then why go to all this trouble?" I demanded. "What's in that warehouse?" The man's eyes flicked toward me, dark and calculating. For a moment, I thought he was going to stay silent. But then, with a slow, deliberate smile, he spoke. "It's not what's in the warehouse," he said quietly. "It's what comes after." I frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" He chuckled again, though there was no humor in it. "You'll see soon enough. Russo's not just after some payday. He's playing the long game. And you're right in the middle of it. Rachel exchanged a glance with me, her eyes narrowing. What long game? The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he shifted slightly under her weight, his grin widening as if he was enjoying this. You think Russo sent you to rob a bank? That was just the beginning. He's building something big. And when it all comes together, no one's going to see it coming. Not you, not the authorities, not anyone. My mind raced as I tried to piece together what he was saying. This wasn't just about the heist anymore. There was something much larger at play, something Russo had kept hidden from us. Rachel's grip on the man tightened, her patience clearly wearing thin. What's he building? Spit it out, or I swear I'll make you wish you had. But the man just smiled, his eyes gleaming with a twisted satisfaction. You'll have to find out for yourself. Before I could react, his hand shot toward his coat, and in one swift motion, he pulled out a small, metallic object. My eyes widened in horror as I realized what it was. A detonator. Get back! I yelled, grabbing Rachel and pulling her away just as the man pressed the button. The ground beneath us shook violently as another explosion ripped through the warehouse. Fire and debris erupted from the far side of the building, and the force of the blast sent us both sprawling to the floor. For a moment, everything was a blur. My ears rang, my vision clouded by smoke and dust. The heat from the explosion washed over us, and I struggled to catch my breath, every muscle in my body screaming in pain. Rachel! I called, my voice barely audible over the ringing in my ears. Rachel! I heard her groan somewhere nearby, and I crawled through the debris, my hands shaking as I searched for her. Through the haze, I finally found her, lying a few feet away, blood trickling from a cut on her forehead. I grabbed her arm, pulling her upright. Come on, we have to move! She nodded weakly, her eyes glassy from the impact, but she managed to stand. We stumbled through the wreckage, the fire spreading rapidly as the warehouse continued to collapse around us. The man was nowhere to be seen. Whether he had survived the blast or not, I didn't know. But right now, it didn't matter. We had to get out before the entire building came down on top of us. We made our way toward the service hatch we had used earlier, the air thick with smoke and heat. Every step was agonizing, my body aching from the blast. But we couldn't stop. Not now. Finally, we reached the hatch, and I helped Rachel through it before crawling in after her. We moved as fast as we could through the narrow tunnel, the sounds of the fire and explosions growing fainter as we put distance between ourselves and the collapsing warehouse. After what felt like an eternity, we emerged on the other side, gasping for fresh air. We collapsed onto the cold ground outside, coughing and choking as we struggled to catch our breath. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. We just lay there, staring up at the night sky, our bodies battered and bruised but alive. Somehow, we had made it out. But as I lay there, my mind raced with everything the man had said. This wasn't over. Whatever Russo was planning, it was bigger than we had realized. And we were right in the middle of it. I rolled onto my side, glancing at Rachel. Her face was grim, her eyes focused on the distant glow of the warehouse fire. We're not done, are we? She asked quietly, her voice hoarse. I shook my head. No. Not even close. Rachel let out a long, shaky breath, wiping the blood from her forehead. So what's next? I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that Russo had just raised the stakes. Whatever game he was playing, it wasn't just about the money anymore. He had something much larger in mind, and we had barely scratched the surface. But one thing was certain, we couldn't walk away now. Not after everything we had been through. We find Russo, I said finally, my voice steady despite the chaos still swirling in my mind. And we stop him. For good. Rachel nodded, her jaw set with determination. Then let's do it. As the fire raged behind us, I felt a sense of resolve harden in my chest. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about stopping whatever twisted plan Russo had put into motion. And we weren't going to stop until we took him down. We gathered our breath for a moment, both of us staring at the smoldering ruins of the warehouse behind us. The distant wail of sirens filled the air, drawing closer as the authorities responded to the explosions. We didn't have much time. "We need to move," I urged, pulling Rachel to her feet. "If they find us here, we're done for." We quickly surveyed our surroundings. The warehouse sat in a relatively isolated part of town, surrounded by overgrown brush and a chain-link fence that had seen better days. If we could make it to the main road, we might be able to hitch a ride or steal a car to get us to safety. Rachel nodded, and we took off toward the fence. As we approached, I spotted a small opening beneath it where the grass and dirt had been disturbed, probably from animals passing through. "Under here," I said, gesturing for her to crawl through. We squeezed beneath the fence, the cool earth pressing against my palms. I quickly followed Rachel, and we emerged on the other side, panting. The sounds of sirens were now much louder, echoing through the night air, but the road was just a few yards ahead. We sprinted toward the asphalt, our hearts pounding in sync with our hurried steps. The road stretched out before us, illuminated by the flickering lights of a nearby street lamp. In the distance, we could see the faint glow of a gas station, its neon sign buzzing ominously. "That's our best shot," Rachel said, pointing toward the station. "We can get inside, maybe find a phone, or see if they have a car we can take." I nodded, and we headed toward it, our adrenaline pushing us onward. As we approached the gas station, I scanned the parking lot for any signs of life. The place seemed deserted, save for a few flickering lights and a vending machine outside that hummed softly in the night. When we reached the entrance, I pulled the glass door open, and we stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit and eerily quiet, but the smell of stale coffee and grease lingered in the air, reminding me that we were still in the real world. Rachel moved to the counter, peering behind it as if hoping to find someone there. "Hello?" she called, but only silence answered. I walked to the back of the store, where a few aisles of snacks and drinks lined the walls. My eyes fell on a battered payphone tucked in the corner. I felt a rush of hope. We could call for help, maybe even contact someone who could help us take down Russo. "Rachel!" I called, turning back to find her still searching behind the counter. "There's a payphone over here. We can call for backup." As I spoke, I saw a shadow move outside the glass door. My heart dropped. "Get down!" I hissed, rushing back to Rachel and pulling her down just as the door swung open with a soft chime. Two figures entered the gas station, their silhouettes barely visible in the low light. I couldn't see their faces, but I could make out the outline of their jackets, dark, heavy fabric, emblazoned with an insignia that sent a chill down my spine. "They're from Russo's crew," I whispered to Rachel, keeping my voice low. "We need to get out of here." "Wait," she replied, her expression hardening as she watched the newcomers. "Let's see what they're up to first." I hesitated but nodded, knowing she was right. If we could gather any intel, it might give us the upper hand. We crouched behind a shelf, straining to hear their conversation. "I don't care if they blew up the warehouse," one of the men growled, his voice low and gravelly. "We need to find them before Russo loses his mind." "They're probably trying to lay low," the other replied, his tone almost casual. "But they're not going to get far. We have eyes everywhere." A shiver ran down my spine at the thought. Russo had eyes everywhere? We were more exposed than I thought. "But what if they try to call for help?" the first man pressed. "If they get a hold of the cops? Then we'll handle it," the second man interrupted, confidence dripping from his words. "We just need to find them before they slip away." They moved toward the back of the store, and I felt my heart race as I grabbed Rachel's arm, ready to pull her back and make a run for it. But then something caught my eye, a half-empty can of soda sitting on the counter. It was too risky to take it, but desperation is a powerful motivator. "Hold on," I whispered, my mind racing. I nodded toward the back exit. "If we can make it to the back and sneak out, we might have a chance to get to the car before they spot us." Rachel nodded, and we crept toward the back of the gas station, trying to remain as quiet as possible. I kept glancing over my shoulder, my stomach churning with anxiety as we approached the door. Just as we reached the exit, The man's voice rang out behind us. "Did you hear that?" My heart stopped. We'd been made. "Let's go!" I hissed, pushing the door open and rushing outside. We burst into the cool night air, the adrenaline surging through me as I grabbed Rachel's hand. We sprinted toward the nearby parking lot, the sound of footsteps pounding behind us. "They're right behind us!" Rachel shouted, her breath coming in quick bursts. I glanced back just in time to see the two men burst through the gas station door, guns drawn, their faces set with determination. "Run!" I yelled, pulling Rachel toward the nearest row of parked cars. We ducked behind a rusty old sedan, our hearts pounding in our chests as we crouched low. I fumbled in my pocket for my phone, desperately trying to remember the last contact I had saved, the only person who might be able to help us in this mess. "Do you have a plan?" Rachel asked, her voice barely above a whisper as she peered around the side of the car. I shook my head. "Not yet. We need to figure out how to get out of here." Just then, I caught sight of something gleaming in the distance, a small sports car parked on the other side of the lot, almost hidden behind a dumpster. It wasn't the best option, but it was better than nothing. "There!" I pointed. "We can take that car." Rachel nodded, her eyes narrowing with determination. "Okay. On 3. We counted down together, and on 3, we bolted toward the car, our feet pounding against the pavement. I reached the driver's side first and fumbled with the door, praying it would open. It clicked, and I threw myself inside, quickly fumbling to find the ignition. Come on, I urged, my heart racing as Rachel hopped in beside me, her eyes wide with fear. She looked over at me, panic etched on her face. "What if it's locked? What if we can't get it started? Just trust me," I snapped, turning the key in the ignition. To my surprise, the engine roared to life, a low rumble that filled me with hope. "Yes," I shouted, glancing back toward the gas station. The two men were closing in, their shouts piercing the air. "Go, go, go!" Rachel yelled, her hands gripping the dashboard as I slammed the car into reverse and sped backward, narrowly missing a concrete barrier. We tore out of the parking lot, the sound of tires screeching against the asphalt echoing behind us. As I swung the car around, I caught a glimpse of the two men sprinting after us, their faces twisted in fury. I pressed the accelerator, the engine growling as we raced down the road. The adrenaline coursed through my veins, but the fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of my mind. "We need to lose them!" Rachel shouted, her voice laced with urgency. "Take a left!" I didn't hesitate, swinging the car onto a side street as we darted through the night. The streets were mostly empty, but the city felt alive with energy. I glanced at the rearview mirror, my stomach sinking as I saw the headlights of the men's car not far behind us. "They're still on us!" I yelled, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. "We need to get somewhere they can't follow," Rachel suggested, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Somewhere they won't expect us." I thought quickly, my mind racing as I tried to remember the layout of the city. "The old subway station. If we can get there, we can lose them in the tunnels." Rachel nodded, her eyes sharp. "Let's do it." I made another sharp turn, heading toward the abandoned station that had been closed for years. It was a risk. An old underground tunnel system could be dangerous, but it was our best shot. As we approached, the darkness loomed ahead, the entrance barely visible in the shadows. I swung the car around, pulling into the station's lot, and slammed the door behind us. We hopped out, and I quickly surveyed the area. The station was quiet, the air thick with dust and the remnants of what had once been a bustling hub of activity. "Down this way," Rachel urged, pointing toward a set of stairs leading down to the platform. We hurried toward it, our footsteps echoing in the silence as we rushed down the dimly lit staircase, the sound of our footsteps reverberating against the concrete walls. The air was cool and stale, tinged with the scent of old metal and dust. We reached the platform, glancing around as we surveyed our surroundings. It was a forgotten place, littered with debris and remnants of a time long past. Rachel turned to me, her face set with determination. We can't just stand here. They'll find us eventually. I nodded, my mind racing. We need to find a way to make this work for us. Russo's men will be searching the area, but they won't expect us to hide down here. I scanned the platform, looking for any potential escape routes. There were a few doors that led to the maintenance tunnels, and I remembered hearing stories of how expansive the subway system used to be. It might just be our ticket to safety. Let's check those doors, I said, pointing toward the dark passageways that branched off from the main platform. We hurried over, but just as we reached the first door, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching from the staircase. My heart raced. We don't have time, Rachel hissed, glancing back nervously. We have to go. We pushed through the door and entered a narrow tunnel that twisted into the darkness. I turned on the flashlight on my phone, illuminating the damp, grimy walls as we ventured deeper into the maintenance passage. The sound of our footsteps echoed, and I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in on us. The tunnel forked ahead, and I hesitated. Which way? Rachel paused, her brow furrowed in concentration. Let's take the left. It should lead us to the service areas where the trains used to stop. We might be able to find an exit. We moved quickly, the adrenaline fueling our pace as we navigated the twisting passages. But the further we went, the more uneasy I felt. It was like stepping into a ghost town, the silence stretching out around us. After what felt like an eternity of walking, we reached a large chamber, the remnants of old tracks still visible. The ceiling above was crumbling, and the shadows danced ominously as our flashlight beams flickered against the walls. There has to be a way out, I muttered, scanning the area. Rachel nodded, her eyes darting around. Look! Over there! She pointed to a set of heavy doors at the far end of the chamber. That could lead us to the street. We rushed toward the doors, my heart pounding with hope. I reached for the handle, but it was locked tight. Damn it! I exclaimed, rattling the door in frustration. Let me try, Rachel said, stepping back. She took a breath, then kicked the door with all her strength. The door groaned in protest but didn't budge. Again! I encouraged, and she kicked it again, harder this time. With a loud crack, the door swung open, and we stumbled through, emerging into another tunnel that sloped upward. Yes! I exclaimed, relief flooding my body. We raced forward, climbing up the incline until we finally reached a hatch that led to the surface. With one final push, I opened the hatch, and we burst out into the cool night air. We found ourselves behind an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The stars twinkled overhead, and for a moment, it felt like we had escaped the nightmare. Where to now? Rachel asked, her breathless excitement palpable. I took a moment to gather my thoughts, the gravity of our situation slowly settling in. We need to find a way to contact the authorities. Russo's not going to stop until we're gone. We have to get this information out there. Rachel nodded in agreement. There's a diner a few blocks away that's open all night. We can use a phone and maybe grab some food. I felt a surge of hope at the idea. The thought of a warm meal and a chance to regroup felt like a victory. Let's go. We made our way through the quiet streets, keeping our heads down and moving quickly. The diner glowed like a beacon in the darkness, and as we approached, I could feel the weight of the past hours begin to lift. Inside, we found a booth in the corner and slid in, the warm air and the smell of coffee wrapping around us like a comforting blanket. As I pulled out my phone, I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the screen. What if the authorities didn't believe us? What if they were already compromised? Rachel reached across the table, her expression steady. We have to trust that there are still good people out there. We know what's at stake, and we can't let Russo win. Taking a deep breath, I nodded and dialed the number for the local police department. The line rang, and I could feel the tension build as I waited for someone to answer. 911, what's your emergency? A calm voice answered on the other end. I launched into our story, detailing everything we had uncovered about Russo and his plans. As I spoke, I could feel the adrenaline coursing through me once more. The urgency in my voice was palpable, and I hoped it conveyed just how serious our situation was. After a few moments of back and forth questioning, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The operator assured me that they would send units to investigate, and that they would take our claims seriously. "We've got to move," I said to Rachel as I hung up, my heart racing. "They'll be here soon." She nodded, glancing out the window. "We need to stay ahead of Russo and his crew. They could be looking for us already." As we left the diner, I felt a sense of purpose wash over me. We were still in danger, but we had a plan. We were no longer just pawns in Russo's game. We were players, fighting back against the odds. We hopped into the first car we saw, an old sedan with a cracked windshield and a few dents, and quickly drove away from the diner, heading toward the city's outskirts. I knew we had to find a safe place to lay low while the authorities handled the situation. As we drove through the streets, I glanced over at Rachel, who had a fierce determination in her eyes. "We're not giving up," she said firmly. "We're going to take this to the end." I nodded in agreement, feeling a renewed sense of hope. We had made it this far together, and we weren't about to let fear dictate our lives any longer. After what felt like hours of driving, we found a small cabin on the outskirts of town. It was secluded and hidden among the trees, the perfect place to hide while we waited for the authorities to catch up with us. We parked the car and made our way inside, the smell of wood and pine filling the air. The cabin was rustic but cozy, and as we settled in, I felt a sense of peace for the first time in days. Days turned into weeks, and we waited for news. We received a few calls from the police, updating us on their progress in tracking down Russo's operation. They had managed to arrest several members of his crew, and it seemed like they were finally beginning to unravel the larger scheme. But we knew Russo was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for his chance to strike again. One evening, as we sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Rachel turned to me, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think we'll ever be free of this?" I considered her question, the weight of our situation pressing on my chest. "I think we will," I replied, my voice steady. "But it's going to take time. We just have to keep fighting." She smiled at me, and in that moment I realized how much we had grown together through this ordeal. We had become partners in every sense of the word, bound by our shared experiences and struggles. A few weeks later, we received a call that would change everything. The authorities had finally tracked down Russo, and a sting operation was in place. They wanted us to help identify him and ensure that he was brought to justice. The night of the operation was tense. We were positioned in a safe house nearby, watching as the police prepared to move in. Rachel and I held hands, a silent promise passing between us. No matter what happened, we would face it together. When the time came, the police moved in, and the air was thick with anticipation. We watched from a distance as they apprehended Russo and his remaining crew, the darkness of the night giving way to flashing lights and the sound of sirens. As they loaded him into a police car, I felt a sense of closure wash over me. It was finally over. In the weeks that followed, life began to return to normal. Rachel and I found a new place together, one where we could rebuild and start fresh. We had both changed through this experience, stronger and more resilient than before. One evening, as we sat on our new porch, I turned to Rachel and took her hand. "We made it," I said softly. "We really made it." She smiled, her eyes sparkling in the fading light. "Yeah, we did. And now we can finally live." As the sun set on the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, I knew we were ready to face whatever came next. Together, we had overcome the odds, and we would continue to do so as long as we had each other. The road ahead was uncertain, but we had hope, courage, and a newfound sense of purpose that would guide us into the future. Days turned into months, and as the dust settled from our harrowing escape and the chaotic confrontation with Russo, we slowly found our rhythm again. The haunting memories of the past lingered, but they no longer held the same power over us. We learned to navigate our lives with caution, but also with a sense of freedom that we hadn't felt before. Rachel threw herself into her work, focusing on her art. She began to paint again, using her experiences as inspiration. Her canvases transformed into vibrant depictions of resilience, hope, and new beginnings. Watching her create was both mesmerizing and healing for me. It was like watching her reclaim her spirit piece by piece. I often found myself lost in her work, recognizing the raw emotion behind each brushstroke. I took on freelance jobs that allowed me to work from home, which gave me the flexibility to be there for Rachel as she dove deeper into her art. We transformed our new place into a cozy haven, filling it with laughter, plants, and memories. We spent lazy Sundays cooking together, hosting small get-togethers with friends who didn't know the whole story but supported us nonetheless. Every so often, we would receive updates from the police about Russo's trial. The authorities had built a solid case against him, and he faced numerous charges, including conspiracy, racketeering, and attempted murder. We were called in as witnesses, but with each passing day, the threat felt more distant. The knowledge that justice was being served brought us a measure of comfort. As the trial approached, we decided to attend. It felt important to witness the end of that chapter in our lives, to see him held accountable for his actions. On the day of the trial, we sat in the courtroom, our hearts racing as we watched the proceedings unfold. The atmosphere was tense, but we felt a sense of solidarity. We were no longer alone in our fight. When Russo finally entered the courtroom, I felt a wave of anger wash over me. He seemed so different from the man I remembered, defiant and arrogant, yet visibly shaken by the weight of the charges against him. As he sat before the judge, the reality of what he had done began to sink in. He was no longer a shadow looming over us. He was just a man, vulnerable and exposed. As the testimonies unfolded, I felt the adrenaline rise within me, each recounting of the events bringing back the fear and anxiety, but also reminding me of our strength. We shared glances, holding onto each other as the prosecutor laid out the evidence against him. It felt cathartic, seeing everything we had endured laid bare in that courtroom. Finally, it was our turn to testify. I could feel the tension in the air as we took the stand. Rachel went first, her voice steady and clear as she recounted her experiences. I watched her, filled with admiration for her courage. She had transformed her pain into strength, and in that moment, I realized just how far we had come. When it was my turn, I felt the weight of the moment. I spoke honestly about our ordeal, detailing how Russo's actions had impacted our lives. The room was silent, every eye on me as I recounted our escape and the fear that had gripped us for so long. I spoke not just for ourselves, but for everyone who had been victimized by his operation. As we stepped down from the stand, I felt a sense of release. We had faced our fears head-on and emerged stronger. The trial wrapped up weeks later, and the verdict came in, guilty on all counts. As the gavel struck, a wave of relief washed over us. Russo was finally going to pay for what he had done. We exchanged glances filled with unshed tears and overwhelming joy. We had fought and won. In the aftermath, our lives slowly returned to a sense of normalcy. We found ourselves looking toward the future with optimism. Rachel's art gained recognition, leading to her first exhibition, where she showcased her pieces inspired by our journey. The opening night was filled with friends, laughter, and applause, a celebration of resilience and rebirth. I stood by her side, beaming with pride as she greeted visitors, sharing her story behind each piece. As the months rolled into years, we continued to build a life together. The trauma from our past never fully disappeared, but we learned how to carry it with us, weaving it into the fabric of our lives. We traveled, explored new places, and embraced experiences that once felt out of reach. Each adventure brought us closer, solidifying our bond. One crisp autumn evening, as we walked hand in hand through a park filled with falling leaves, I stopped and turned to Rachel. "You know, I never imagined we'd come this far," I said softly. "Sometimes it feels surreal." She smiled, her eyes shimmering with warmth. "Life is unpredictable, but we've made it. Together." I paused, searching her gaze for the right words. "I can't imagine my life without you." You're my partner in every sense. Will you continue this journey with me? Her smile widened, and she squeezed my hand. Always. With a racing heart, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. As I knelt down on one knee, the world around us faded, and all I could see was her. Rachel, I began. Will you marry me? Her eyes widened in surprise, and a laugh of joy escaped her lips. Yes. Yes, of course. I slipped the ring onto her finger, and she pulled me into a tight embrace, her laughter echoing through the park. In that moment, I realized that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we had each other, and that was enough. As we stood together, enveloped in love and hope, I felt a new chapter unfolding before us. We had survived the storm and emerged stronger, ready to embrace whatever came next. Together, we would face the world, hand in hand, with a story that was still being written. And as the sun set on the horizon, painting the sky with brilliant shades of orange and pink,